On today's episode, I'd like to welcome Jodi Krangle as my guest. Jodi, welcome to Relational Introvert.
Thanks so much for having me here. I'm looking forward to this.
Yeah, me too. I'm definitely looking forward to expanding the conversation that you and I had a few weeks ago. To kick us off, though, I would love for you to share a little bit about yourself with everyone who's listening in.
Okay. Well, I've been a voice actor since 2007, and I've worked with clients all over the world. So I work with, people like Bose and Dell and BBVA and Kraft and a whole lot more. Obviously, the type of industries have changed since we've gone into this interesting lockdown. But it took me a while to get there because my background actually is mostly in tech. And I started off selling computers way back when the 386SX was new. So back in the day, not a lot of women doing that at that point, actually. And I launched a songwriting website in 1995 called The Muse's Muse. And I worked that for a long time, and it taught me a lot about SEO and internet marketing. And when I decided to switch over to voiceovers, I had that advantage, thankfully, that I knew the internet really well.
Right.
I've really loved it. I'm also a singer, so I have an album of my own that I put together with a friend of mine named Chris Conway in the UK. And that's from 2015. That's also on my website. And I have a podcast called Audio Branding.
Nice.
Because of voiceovers and what I do, a lot of what I do is helping companies and industries and products and services brand themselves in an audio way. Part of what I do is branding them audio, I just really love the idea of it. So I'm not an expert by any means, but I question a lot of people and interview a lot of people who are very knowledgeable on the subject, and it's been a real thrill. That I'm totally fine during all of this lockdown. The virtual thing has been my life. Like I love it. It's great. I will say that it would have been a lot harder had we not had the current technology level. I remember years and years past when we didn't have this kind of connectivity between us technology-wise.
Right.
And I think this kind of a thing would have been a lot harder had we not had video chats and all of those things that are allowing us to keep in contact without actually touching one another.
Right.
That's made it a lot easier. But for me, I like the idea of being able to be virtual with the people that I care about so I can keep in contact, but I can turn that off when I need to.
Yes.
And just, the idea of wearing yoga pants every day doesn't hurt either. Kind of like that part, gotta say. But that's my job, right? Like my job hasn't changed much since this whole thing started.
That's a really good point. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that, it's interesting you bring up this idea of being okay with the space, like the distance that this has created.
Mm-hmm.
I actually was chatting with another extroverted friend, and actually a couple of them, now that I think about it, and they talked about how that's been the challenge, is like for them, this idea of the space has been something that is depleting of energy, whereas for us, it's not so much that we don't want to see those that we love, it's that we're not depleted. And I feel like that's the difference that one of the big differences that I can notice in the current time that we're all in.
Very much so. And I think you, like me, we are kind of forced to be extroverts in our jobs because that's like we have to relate to people, we have to talk to people, we have to communicate and network and all of that. And I'm fine with doing that. I'm just more fine with doing it virtually. It just makes it way easier for me.
Yes. Well, you bring up a really good point about this idea of you said that we have to be more extroverted, and I look at it this way. I always look at introversion, extroversion as a spectrum, that none of us, yes, there's those of us who are extreme on either end of it, but most of us, I feel, travel that spectrum at certain points.
Yeah.
And we all have the ability and realization of knowing, and that goes for extroverts true too, to be able to bounce back and forth as needed. And so when I think about myself, especially, I don't really have an issue being in front of people. I don't really have an issue speaking in front of people, which sometimes people feel are the things that might be the stretch that's happening. And I said,
Hmm.
actually, that's not the stretch for me. It might be to the degree to which I have to do it, how
Hmm.
long I have to do it. It's more about the fact that I probably need to come back and recharge myself. Whereas my someone who's more extroverted than I am would probably be getting charged up
Hmm.
during that time. So we show up the same way, but what's happening internal is a little bit different. It's not that either of us is not able to do it. It's just some of us actually enjoy that, but are charged in a different way.
Yeah, definitely. And being able to turn off the computer and step away and not have to be in a virtual environment if you don't want to be, for the most part. I mean, I'm sure people have to have virtual, board meetings or whatever they need to
Right.
do for their companies. These things happen, but you do them for a limited amount of time and then you can step away and,
Yes.
no one's seeing what you're doing when you're not on those.
Right. Right.
And like you, I get my charge back by being alone, by having quiet time. Um, this might sound really strange for someone who deals so much in audio, but when I am recharging, silence is my best friend. I really, really enjoy silence. I find it really hard
Yes.
to focus if I have music playing in the background. My
Yes.
husband is completely different. He loves media wallpaper. I call it media wallpaper. He loves having like the television on and the radio or whatever music going in the background. Like something's always going on in the background. I need him to close his door.
The work that you do with your podcast, you mentioned, it's all about how sound influences people, which
Hmm.
obviously is the journey that you've come through to bring it to this point. So tell
Sure.
us a little bit about what that means and what is happening, like what's the purpose of your podcast?
Well, I want people to be more conscious and intentional on how they use sound, especially in their advertising and marketing. I think, especially now, because we are completely inundated with sight. We're all on the internet. We're watching a bunch of different things on a daily basis. We have ads coming at us from everywhere, and
Mm,
it's all visual. It's all visual. And I don't know about you, but I get overwhelmed. And so I have to either turn it off or just not look at the visual and concentrate on something else. And the something else for me would be the audio. So if I hear an audio portion to an advertising or marketing pitch, it's more likely to hit me in the heart than it is if I'm looking at it. And I'm different from a bunch of people, but
mm,
it seems to me like that is a quick way to reach an audience that's overwhelmed otherwise. It cuts through the noise.
right.
So, yeah, so the idea of the podcast is basically to allow people to think a little more on how they use audio in their campaigns and in how they present their company. Are they being consistent? Very, just at the very basics. What does your company sound like? What should it sound like? What are the colors you're using for your logo? What aesthetic do you have? Are you casual or formal? Or is
Mm,
there a scale there? That'll have to do with what kind of music you use on your on hold. It'll have to do with the voice that you use for your campaigns when you're talking about voiceover, the music that you use underneath the voice, or whether or not you use voiceover at all, the music you use in your video, anything that you do with your company that has a sound component. Is it consistent and does it match the sight and feel the emotion that you want people to feel when they look and hear your company? Because it is all about emotion.
I've never heard of sound being part of the brand. I've always heard about the visual, and I don't know
Mm-hmm.
that I have actually even intentionally taken a step back and thought about what is the sound like.
Mm-hmm.
I probably have to actually, let me take that step back. I probably have done that with my podcast because
Mm-hmm.
really this podcast is both audio and a visual component, especially I mentioned earlier when I had guests on to have that visual component on there.
Mm-hmm.
But the audio component, without getting too technical, I did have to do some thinking around what music would I want to have that is introing in that lines up with this podcast plus who I am, because a lot
Mm-hmm.
of branding is really who you are. Who do you want to
Yeah,
show up as? And
definitely.
that's the brand. But you're right. I don't think I've actually been very conscious of that everywhere else. So that's actually a really interesting point. What do you find when you are having that conversation with people? How mindful are people about audio when it comes to branding?
Less than they should be, which
Mm,
is kind of why this discussion started in the first place. Podcasts have an interesting challenge in that they're very curated content that is meant to touch someone individually and intimately.
mm,
So it's like more intimate radio, you know? And so I think a lot of podcasters should really think about the music that they use in the beginning,
mm,
the announcer that they use to announce their podcast, and a good voice actor, depending on whether male or female or if they have any good training, and hopefully if they're making a living at this, they have some training, they can modify their voice tone to fit the music that is wanting to be used, to fit the tone of the podcast itself. So they can be flirty and playful, or they can be announcery and, dramatic, or they can be authoritative and informational, and there's like different types of feels that you can have for the type of podcast that you're putting together.
I'm
Mm.
actually thinking about, even as we were talking about sound, one of the things that comes up often is the absence of sound and the
Mhm.
use of silence. So, not just from a marketing perspective, I think about it in regular conversation. The use of silence is one of those things that we know is very powerful. It's also very uncomfortable,
Mhm.
especially in more conversationally. If it's planned, then not so much, but
Mhm.
conversationally, allowing that space is something that creates this discomfort, the sense of like, I need to fill it with something. And I know that we talk about introverts being folks who are okay with silence.
Yeah.
And I feel that there's also another side to that. I feel we're okay with silence on our own. We may not always be okay with silence when we're having conversation with other people. So so I'm curious what your thoughts are, like what comes up for you when you think about sound and the absence of it, not just from a marketing perspective, but also just conversationally.
I think it makes people lean in, like kind of when people speak softly.
Mm,
So I think it has its place, definitely. And I know that public speakers use it a lot to very good effect. And of course, in advertising, you have white space. I mean, white space has a purpose. It has a
yes,
purpose for relaxing your mind, not overstimulating you.
right.
So I think that silence has a place in that too.
Yes. Even in music, I suppose I think about music, like there's the rest is there
Mhm.
for so that you just don't have a run on of notes and noise.
Well, breath is important.
Mm,
Breathing is important. Even when I'm editing, say, a voiceover script, even if I'm removing the breath so that you don't hear it, the space is still there so you can imagine it. It just makes it sound less robotic.
have you come to an understanding of what your brand is through all this work that you've done?
Yeah, yeah, I'm pretty sure of what my brand is. On
How
my
would you
website,
describe
it's
that?
pretty obvious. Um, oh, how do I put that into words? Well, the the slogan on my website is world-class sound gold standard service.
Mm.
So, and the picture that's on my website is of a microphone with a necklace draped over it that is like this diamond. It's like a diamond microphone
Mm.
draped over the microphone. So, I mean, I like to think that it's uh, economy of sound, economy of space, and calmness. I'm not gravelly. I'm not urban. I'm not even going to pretend to be. um, I think it's more of what you experience as far as emotions are concerned when you look at the website and when you hear me speak.
Mm.
And that combination can mean a lot of things to different people, but I'm always me.